You may have heard the phrase separating infrastructure config from infrastructure code. If you've used any configuration management tools like Puppet or Chef, you'll know that separating configuration allows your modules and your cookbooks to become more flexible and applied and adapt to any environment that you're using those modules and cookbooks within. So how can we apply this same concept to Docker? In this video, I'm going to show you an excellent tool called Confd that allows us to use those same principles inside of our Docker images. This applies to any Docker image that you want to build. Specifically, we're looking at PHP images today, but this is a principle that you can apply to any type of Docker image that you would want to build. So Confd is simply a way to manage local application configuration files using templates and data from data sources like etcd or console, or in our case, we're going to use environment variables. Confd supports a variety of different backends for storing your actual configuration data. So let's look at a quick example of how Confd works. I have an example folder here, and I'm just going to show you how to run this on your local system first, and then we'll apply it to our Docker images. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how to install this thing. So if we go down to the README Getting Started section, you'll see that it's easy as running wget. So let's copy this. Go back over to our console, and just a note on the Mac, you may have to do brew install wget if you're using Homebrew. Or you can download this in any way that you want. In this case, we're going to use wget. We're going to do user plus x confd. So if we run confd without any arguments, you'll see that it runs in the foreground and it gives us a warning that it can't load templates. So by default, confd wants to look in etc confd for some template resources. So let's back out of there. And in this case, we actually have our configuration and our templates here in this project. So we need to pass a different flag in order to run this. First, let's look at the two different types of files that make Confd work. So first of all, we have our toml configuration. This is a simple configuration format, and I'll let you do the research on toml, but it's very straightforward and understandable. You can probably go through the Confd documentation and make sense of this without really even learning toml at first, but I would recommend that you go check it out and what toml is and how it's designed. So in this case, we're defining a template. We're saying that the source of the template is example.tmpl, and this format is actually the Golang text template format. We're going to look at this file in a minute. The next value is the destination. Where do we want this template to end up when its configuration has been applied? The owner and the mode or the permissions. Next, we have a templates folder, and notice that this is relative. So Confd has a convention in which it expects to look for this file. In our case, or by default, it would be etc confd templates. So inside of our template here, I have an example here of using get env, and we're looking for an env called example items, and we're going to split it by comma, and then we're going to basically loop through and output each item. So that's it, really. That's all you need to know to really start using Confd. In order to actually demonstrate this to you, we need an environment variable. So in the context of Docker, once we get there, we will have environment variables being configured when the container runs and use these to apply different changes to the image. So I'm going to export this example items environment variable, and let's just echo it out, and there you go. Next, we need to actually run this thing. So to do that, we're going to use our local confd that we installed. We're going to use the one-time flag. We're going to configure a backend as env, and we're going to say that our confdir is examples relatively from our project. So when I run this, it's going to give us some information and tell us that our file is out of sync and that it has been updated. So if we cat this, hello world file, we'll see that we have our original environment variable value split and output into 3 lines. If I run export again, let's add a 4th one. So if I run this again, you'll see that it has this MD5 sum when it should actually be this sum. Therefore, it's out of sync and has been updated. So if we output this file again, there's our example 4. So essentially that's how Confd works. It takes a template with values from a backend, like in our case, environment variables, and then it outputs the end result. So we can use this to our advantage during runtime when we're starting up a container. So let's look at how we might do that. So first, let's look at the Docker file that we're going to demonstrate using this with. This is extending from the official PHP image. We've set a few environment variables. These are environment variables for PHP ini configuration. This is actually a really good point to make. PHP really doesn't need Confd in some cases because we can use environment variables directly inside of our ini files. So in this case, we provide some sensible defaults in the env in the Docker file. So if I trace this back to our opcache config, there it is. This will be evaluated from the environment variable at runtime, which is really neat. So PHP really doesn't need Confd in order to be flexible. In this case, anytime we want to apply opcache, granted we can only use these values, but we can tweak them and make them configurable. One disadvantage here is that we can't really unset these values. So anyway, back to our Docker file here. You'll notice that we're just installing a few requirements here. We're installing supervisor, SQLite, nginx, and that's actually what we're going to look at using Confd to configure in a dynamic fashion. So let's go over to the actual nginx configuration. Somewhere in here, at this point, we're copying in this default server configuration into our sites available default. And this allows us to define our server configuration. So up here in this image, we have a config folder, and then we have a default. And here I've added an empty server here to demonstrate just some examples of why this might be an inflexible configuration. You'll notice here that I've hard-coded server name example.com. In some cases, this might even be something like an upstream or a backend that's dynamic per environment. And we can't really hard code that, can we? But using Confd, we can make this dynamic and at runtime even switch it, which we're not going to get into in this video. But you can use Confd to hot swap this and do a graceful restart of nginx and keep the container running at the same time. So back to this example, I've defined an empty server that is 404, and I'm going to show you why in a second. But first of all, we're going to do a docker compose up. I've already built this image. I'm going to run it in the background. If I run docker ps, I have this image running on port 8080. So if I jump over to Firefox and type in localhost 8080, it's going to hit that default server. I've hard-coded in my hosts file example.com. So if I go back here to this server definition, I have example.com. I'm going to just show you this. I have example.com hard-coded here just for this demonstration purposes. So now if I go over to, instead of localhost, if I use example.com, you can see that I'm outputting PHP info and using this server block because the server name matches. But this is really inflexible. If we wanted to version control this image and allow others to extend it, they would have to basically take this file, override everything that they needed instead of just using it as is. They would have to basically reproduce all of this configuration on their own, which I guess is okay, but it's not very, it's very inflexible. And in the case of upstream and backends, there's no way that we can really dynamically do this per environment, which is very annoying. So that's kind of the background of what we're going to do. In this case, we're going to make this server name example.com dynamic using environment config. So in order to do that, we're going to take the same approach that we did in this examples folder inside of our Docker configuration and copy it into the image and use Confd inside of Docker. So let's get started with that. Let's first create the file. So I have my organization and I have a config folder. Inside of it, I have my nginx config. I have some HTML5 boilerplate config that I pulled in because I would probably use this on a base image that I would extend in my own projects. I have a PHP folder that has my ini configuration, and it also has my pool configuration. And you can see a couple configuration values that I have. In this case, I'm changing to listen on a socket instead of an IP address. my actual PHP ini file with a few example values in here, and then I'm running nginx and PHP together through supervisor. Finally, I'm using this start script, and if I go back to the Docker file at the bottom here, you'll notice that inside of the image, I'm running this start command, and this is essentially all it's doing. Just for example purposes, it's pretty simple, but in the case of using Laravel, I'll sometimes define different environment roles that allow me to run the same image in different contexts, such as an application server, a scheduler, or a queue. In this case, I've just defined only one role, and otherwise it will not match, and that is just serving our application files. So in the end, this is going to run nginx and PHP FPM. And then I'm finally running supervisor to make it all work. So going back to the configuration, let's make a new folder here called Confd. And inside of there, we're going to mirror our examples. We're going to have a Confd folder and a templates folder. So we're going to have a conf.d, and then we're going to have templates. Inside of here, we're going to make a new file, nginx default.toml. And we're going to have the same name here, nginx default. So this is our Golang template. So right off the bat, let's take this block. We're going to just take the whole thing for now. Yeah, we're going to paste it right in here. And since it's a TOML file, actually, we still just want to use a different language mode. I'm going to use nginx to give a little syntax highlighting here. I'm not really going to demonstrate in this video how to build an upstream backend dynamically with Confd, but maybe in a future video. I'm going to leave the default server in here so that we can test our configuration and make sure that by default we're hitting this when the server name doesn't match, just for example purposes. And we're going to make this value dynamic. So in server name, we're going to use, again, this is our Confd template, get env, and we're going to name it nginx server name. It gives us a little context that it's an nginx environment value, and then server name to match what we're actually changing here. So the next thing we need is probably a default in case we are not actually setting one, and I think a sensible default in most cases. We're going to add this to our env instruction here. We're going to use underscore, which is kind of a default convention server name with nginx. Okay, so that's really the only dynamic value we're going to do in this video just to demonstrate how this works. So we need to define this value, and by doing so makes this dynamic, and at runtime this server config will match whatever we configure in our environment variable. That's essentially how it all works together. Now we need to jump over to the actual configuration file, and we're going to make it a template. We're going to say that the source is nginx default.tmpl. The destination is going to be a little different. If I jump back to our examples here, we'll see that the destination was temp. This needs to actually go into the place nginx would look for it. So back in our Docker file, that would be right here. So after confd applies the environment variables and generates the file, that's where it will end up. We're going to use the owner equals root. The mode is going to equal 0644. So the first step that we're going to take here is we're going to actually copy this all into the container, and then we're going to apply it manually so you can see how it works inside the container. So the next step here is to actually copy these files, and we actually need to get confd inside of the Docker image so that we can run it in our start script. So let's start with copying these files into the image. We're going to add another block here called confd. We're going to copy config confd, and we're going to do etc confd. So let's just see if this actually works. So we're going to do, I'm using Docker Compose for convenience, but we're just going to do a Docker Compose build, and let's see what happens. We're going to do a Docker Compose run app bin bash. So we're going to get a bash session here, and we're going to go into etc confd, and let's see what this looks like. All right, so this is exactly what we wanted. If we actually explore further, there's our file. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is jump back out of the container, and we're going to actually install confd. So if we remember from the first time we ran it, we're going to grab that URL through a Docker add instruction. If we look a little further down here, we're doing some permission-y type things and making our start script executable. This kind of seems like a good place where we can add Confd. So let's add it there. And then inside of this next run block, we're just going to combine what we're doing here and actually make Confd executable. So let's just add a line here. So with that, let's go back and do a Docker compose build. Okay, and we're going to do a Docker compose run again. And let's just see if I can find it. There we go. So, whoops. I was trying to run it like I was locally. So I don't need that. It's not in the local path. Confd help will give us all of the flags that we can use. Okay, so now that we have Confd running and we have our templates, we can actually just run a similar command to what we did earlier and see if our changes are applied. So first, let's cat out the etc nginx sites available default. So you can see that this is our hard-coded server name example.com. So in this case, we're going to run confd. We're going to do it one time. Our backend is going to be, well, I'm sorry, before we do this, we actually need an environment configuration. So let's see, nginx server name is set to underscore. So we do have a value here that we can use. So let's go ahead and make it the default. And we can override this at runtime. So confd one time, backend is env, and this should do the trick for us. Okay, so similar output to how we were running it locally, and I would recommend that you run this locally to play around with and learn how to use it. So we can see that we have a different MD5 sum, and therefore it was out of sync and updated. So let's see if our change was actually applied. So if I cat out that file, you can see now my server name is being dynamically updated. So we're just about done here. Actually, we are done. It's just a matter of now automating this instead of doing it manually inside of the container. So we're going to exit back out. And in this case, the next step is going to be at runtime. We just need to apply this change before we actually spin up our services. So we need to run confd one time. Backend is env. And that's it. So let's try it out. If we go back and do a Docker compose build, we're going to rebuild our Docker image. I'm going to do Docker compose down because I think we have a container running, and we're going to do Docker compose up and run it in the background. So if I go to Docker compose logs, we should see some output here. And we do. Excellent. So you can see that these log files, it runs confd during startup, and then it actually starts up nginx and PHP FPM. So let's go see what happens in the browser. So if I hit refresh, example.com is not defined anymore. So let's go to localhost 8080, and that's not found. So in order to actually use that, we're just going to, I did this so I can prove to you that example.com no longer works with our image running. So back in our Docker compose file, we're going to define some environment inside of our application service here. So if I use the environment key, I'm going to add nginx server name, and we're going to make this example.com. Okay, so if we do Docker compose down, let's stop our old image. Docker compose, we don't need a build actually, we just need to up nd. And let's go inspect this and just prove out that this environment variable actually made the container at runtime work differently. So let's do a Docker exec. We're going to make this interactive. Take the image ID. Another nice trick here is that you can just type the first couple characters of a container ID and it will figure out which one you want to go in. Okay, so we're going to cat out etc nginx sites available and default. And there you have it. The server name is example.com using our environment. So just to prove further that this works, let's make it www.example.com. So I'm hitting save here, but this actually is running with the other environment variable. So if I type in example.com at this point, our image will work again because of my host hack. So I've changed it to www.example.com. Let's jump out of here and shut down our image. Docker compose up D. Now this shouldn't work again. Let's go look again. Docker exec. Not car. Sites available defaults. And there it is. So just a quick recap. We can use Confd at runtime with this backend is environment. So this happens one time during startup, but we can use Confd to run our environment variable backend, define customizable templates that allow us to be very flexible. In this case, we can dynamically set the server name. This image is incredibly reusable now. Obviously, I just chose a very simple value to override to demonstrate this, but I think that you could take this further with different areas that you want.